listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this week we are joined by a guest, Dr. Edouard Morena, to talk about climate philanthropy. So Edouard is a senior lecturer in French studies and international politics at the University of London's Institute in Paris, and he's also the author of a number of papers and books about climate, and particularly the role that philanthropy and philanthropic foundations play in climate, particularly 2016 book, The Price of Climate Action, Philanthropic Foundations in the International Climate Debate. And I sat down with Edouard just this week, in fact, so this is a very hot off the press edition of the podcast, to talk about the whole question of the intersection of climate and philanthropy. So we talked about how much philanthropy is actually focused on climate at the moment as a proportion of philanthropy overall, and also how much of the overall activity around climate is kind of driven by philanthropy and philanthropic funders. Given that, relatively small scale of philanthropy in relation to the size of the problem, we talked about whether philanthropy can play a meaningful role, with respect to an issue of the scale of climate. We also talked about what kind of form the action that philanthropy is involved in doing and funding takes. Is it primarily downstream activity? Is it kind of addressing the symptoms of climate issues, or is it upstream activity, kind of research and advocacy designed to address some of the underlying issues at a systemic level? We also talked about the current context politically, where obviously the election of Donald Trump in recent months has raised new challenges for climate, with him pulling the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement and also making it clear that his administration is taking a kind of hard line against climate policies. And we talked about whether this poses a challenge for funders in terms of whether they decide to go along with that in the interests of kind of staying on the right side of government, or whether they lean into it to some extent and decide to kind of fund counter to government policy, and whether that raises kind of theoretical issues in terms of the democratic status of philanthropy, and whether it kind of raises practical challenges in terms of those funders opening themselves up for criticism. We also talked about the way in which the world of technology has influenced how we think about climate as an issue and how that relates to philanthropy, and whether the kind of the worldview of people who've made their money in technology naturally leads them to see technology often as the solution to lots of the world's problems, including climate problems. And whether that had kind of skewed the emphasis of efforts within the climate space to kind of technological fixes rather than issues that are more political in nature, or approaches that are more political. We also talked about whether the US's stance on climate issues under the new administration might open up space for funders from other parts of the world to step in and take a lead on climate issues, and if so, what that might look like. And then we also discussed the issue of climate justice and what that means, firstly, but also why in recent years there's been something of a kind of emphasis on the need to shift from traditional approaches to addressing climate issues through to more justice-focused ones, and whether, again, that was something that we had seen go back in the other direction in recent months, and what that would mean for the climate space overall. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. I thought it was a really fascinating one, so I hope you all enjoy it, and it's a really timely issue, I think you'll agree. I'll be back at the end for the usual bit of housekeeping and tidying up, but for now, here's Edouard. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Edouard Morena. Hi there, Edouard.
Hi.
Oh, well, great to have you on the podcast. Yeah, really looking forward to having the chance to talk. So, I mean, maybe the best place to start, the subject that we're going to be talking about is kind of climate philanthropy, and particularly, the role of philanthropic funders and actors in the climate space. Maybe you could just say a bit about your own interest in that topic and kind of how you came to be studying in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I became interested in climate philanthropy by chance, really. I mean, initially, I was more interested in studying NGOs. I was also interested in I focused a lot on the climate justice movement. So it was really kind of while doing research on non-state actors, and in particular kind of actors within the climate justice movement, that I kind of stumbled. I came across philanthropy really through conversations I was having with different actors in the climate justice space. And so this was in the period leading up to COP21. So in 2015, when I was kind of involved in kind of a collective research project. It was kind of an ethnographic, essentially a study of kind of COP21, and so different actors and how they engage in that particular space. So as I say, I didn't really have any prior expertise on philanthropy, and I really kind of discovered it through kind of actors who engage with philanthropy.
Great. And I guess, I mean, there's a lot to cover. I guess an interesting starting point would just be to get a sort of a snapshot from you of your sense of what role philanthropy is currently playing in terms of climate issues. I mean, are philanthropic funders and actors meaningful players in this space at the moment, or actually are they only bit part players? And I guess from the point of view of philanthropy, how much philanthropy overall is focused on climate? Is it a meaningful proportion, or is it still only a small amount?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a difficult question to answer, and I would imagine that applies for anyone working on philanthropy, really, kind of what is philanthropy's impact? Because I guess, I mean, first of all, philanthropy sometimes, depending on the context, it will kind of either overstate or understate its role and its influence. And at the same time, obviously, the nature of philanthropy itself and how kind of philanthropic actors engage makes it also very difficult to kind of identify kind of a linear connection between, what a philanthropy wants and an outcome. Especially as they don't kind of directly engage necessarily with policy actors. They kind of go through grantees, but also it's not just a question of money. It's also about kind of how they their capacity to also kind of create connections between actors. So I guess again again, as I'm really not an expert on the matter, I'm sure that people have within kind of the philanthropy kind of studies field have tried to kind of identify kind of benchmarks or criteria upon which to evaluate their impact. But that being said, I would nevertheless argue that philanthropic actors did play an important role and continue to play quite an important role within the international climate space. And the reason why I would argue this is that if you just look at the particular kind of non-state actors involved in the international climate policy space, first of all, there aren't that many. And when you look at who funds them, it's actually a fairly small number of philanthropic foundations that are kind of supporting these organizations. So just simply from that perspective, in terms of just even allowing kind of non-state actors, NGOs, movements to exist and engage within the international climate policy space, I would say that philanthropy is a very important actor in that respect, because they're clearly the dominant funder of a number of non-state actors involved in the international climate conversation.
And picking up on what you were saying there, I mean, in terms of thinking about what sorts of things philanthropy is currently doing, should we be thinking of it in terms of, some of that work being essentially kind of downstream work that is in the climate field, but addressing maybe, the impacts of climate, and some of it being upstream, which is more focused on advocacy and research that's kind of intended to address some of the underlying causes? Do you have any sense of what the split between those things is across the sector as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it kind of mirrors as well where the kind of climate conversation is right now. I mean, there's always this kind of debate on do we focus more on mitigation or on adaptation? Do we try and put resources into kind of preparing ourselves, like collectively, for the impacts of the climate crisis, or should we, try to kind of focus more on policies to try and mitigate, to reduce emissions and to ensure that we stay within kind of a global kind of temperature increase that is kind of manageable? I would say that at least until recently, the main focus of climate philanthropy has been on mitigation, and that's taken different shapes. So it's been both focusing on policy, trying to kind of push through policies. Again, it can be through the work that they did around the kind of Paris Climate Agreement, for instance, but also work more on the national or the regional level. So in the US, pushing for the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, getting kind of the federal government, at least under Biden, to kind of massively invest in the low carbon transition, but also at the European level, for instance, through the work that they did around the Green Deal, for example. So there has been historically a kind of a tendency to focus a lot on influencing policy, and the main argument and the main reason for that is that, and this is something I've always found quite interesting, is that from the outset, the philanthropies who are the most involved in the climate debate, they acknowledge the fact that we will the low carbon transition will require massive government investment, and it will require kind of policies, government policies. So so essentially through philanthropy by itself, or businesses or economic actors by themselves will not be able to bring about the required transition. We're going to need kind of a policy environment that enables that to happen, and that also kind of nudges private actors, investors, companies to kind of engage in the transition. But we'll also need public money, and a lot of public money, to ensure that transition actually takes place. So that's why, again, from the outset, there's been quite a big focus on policy. But also what we're seeing, and what we started to see as well over the past maybe 5-10 years, and this is something, for instance, that Bill Gates has been particularly interested in, is this kind of idea of also the kind of focus on technology. Through his work on kind of breakthrough energy, for instance, he's been funding research, for instance, on kind of new technologies, relating sometimes kind of connected to either kind of nuclear or geoengineering or things like that, carbon capture. And this is also something that philanthropy has also been invested in, and sometimes actually it's actually even funded. And I don't know exactly how they've done that from just a legal standpoint. They also funded actually for-profit companies as well, or startups. So kind of direct investment into startups, developing kind of new technological breakthroughs around clean energy in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, but my suspicion would be, increasingly one of the sort of trends within the philanthropy world is this kind of hybridization where people are using non-traditional structures for funding, like LLCs, and then you can have a combination of funding for-profit entities and not-for-profit.
I think that's the case, for instance, of the Bezos Earth Fund. I think it is an LLC, which also obviously raises another series of questions relating to the question of transparency, because it makes it also more difficult to actually know what exactly they're funding, because they don't have to provide any information essentially on who they're making grants to, which from a research perspective is obviously also kind of an issue. So you have to kind of guess, well, you can get information, but it's more difficult, I guess, to get that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of things I wanted to pick up on there. One of them is sort of a wider point that gets raised in philanthropy is, at the moment, we're sort of at a point in time where tech wealth is having a sort of disproportionate impact on shaping philanthropy, because so many of the big fortunes have been made in that way. And, some people sort of then argue that actually that shapes their thinking when it comes to addressing social problems or environmental. So, you have a tendency to assume that the way in which you made your own success is likely to be the answer to the world's problems. Is there any sense that the kind of the interest in technological solutions to climate from climate funders reflects that to some extent?
Yeah, I would tend to say yes. Again, in a way, it's not even restricted to philanthropy. I would say that our understanding of the climate issue has been kind of largely shaped by Californian environmentalism, essentially, and in particular the one that kind of grew out of Palo Alto and the Silicon Valley. And and I think that's really interesting as well when you analyze philanthropy, or as I say, the environmental movement more generally, and the kind of the dominant narratives and dominant approaches to environmentalism. I think it's always important to also obviously connect them to the broader kind of picture and the broader context. And as you mentioned, the rise of tech, which is kind of a phenomenon that actually is we can't even trace back to the 60s and 70s, it's is really important in order to also understand why we shape the environmental problem or the environmental issue in the way we do. And I always like to use that kind of blue marble picture. I think it was the first time we took a picture of Earth from space, and the impact that had on us. Well, then you can see how, again, kind of how the technology and innovation, by providing us this ability to kind of view the Earth from space as kind of an entity, that also, in a way, contributed to shape our understanding of the environmental problem as a global problem. And this kind of idea that we're all in this together, this kind of idea of spaceship Earth, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, even if you look at the Club of Rome report, again, it's also largely due to the development of cybernetics. It was the first time that we were starting to do kind of computer modeling. So there is, for me, that real kind of connection between the way we frame the climate issue and the role of technology, both, as I say, as an economic actor, but also as a cultural actor. And so in a way, it's not really surprising as well to see that, a lot of the climate philanthropy, or at least the most active climate philanthropy, is also a climate philanthropy that is based in many ways, in many cases, on the west coast of the US, and more specifically in the Silicon Valley. Historically, foundations like Hewlett and Packard, for instance, they have historically played a big role, and they continue to play a big role. But also more recently, a number of kind of either tech entrepreneurs, but also how do you say it, like financial investors, who built their fortunes by investing in tech. They are also big players in the climate philanthropy space. And again, I think that's kind of a reflection of these kind of broader trends that we've been seeing, which again are not just economic, because I think there is an economic dimension to all this, because I think that at least in the past, addressing the climate crisis was also seen to an extent as an economic opportunity for tech firms in particular, for the tech sector more generally. There's also kind of a cultural element as well related to that, which is also this kind of, the kind of the narrative around tech, and this kind of idea that tech is politically neutral, that, tech is a tool, that tech essentially is something that can serve the purpose of addressing the world's biggest problems, and that's something again that I find a lot of within the climate philanthropy space. But as I say, the environmental movement more generally.
Yeah, and it feels like it's a particular example of something that you see a lot, kind of more widely within philanthropy, which is this tension you often get between pragmatism on the one hand and the sort of reality that you need to work with the world as it is to some extent in order to drive change, and the kind of more idealistic version of actually this might require fundamental change to the structures and systems that operate. Within the world of sort of climate at the moment, what's your sense of that balance between whether seeking technological fixes or pragmatic solutions in the here and now, whether that's helpful and necessary, or whether it kind of actually gets in the way of the necessary momentum for more fundamental change to society or the economic structures that we use?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I would say maybe that the in a way, what's kind of interesting as well, and what I feel is also indirectly being kind of asked through your question is this kind of idea that technology is a pragmatic solution, when actually, I think that's actually, it's not necessarily that pragmatic as a solution. So I think that's also what I find really interesting, is to see how, these climate philanthropies in particular have kind of succeeded in imposing this idea, or at least normalizing this idea that kind of technology is a pragmatic solution, and we've seen that, as I say, we're increasingly seeing that even with things that even 5 years ago were not considered as pragmatic solutions, like, geoengineering, for instance. Now it's presented as, a pragmatic solution to the climate issue, when just 5 or 10 years ago it wasn't. It was considered as something that was completely, outrageous in a way. But also, even just before Trump's election, what was kind of fascinating to see is how AI was also presented as a pragmatic solution, as a tool to address the climate issue, as something that was really useful for the climate, for addressing the climate crisis. But now, with the election or the re-election of Donald Trump, suddenly that kind of narrative has just completely disappeared, because essentially that narrative is no longer necessary, because, you have a government that is willing to use kind of fossil fuel energy to kind of to power the data centers that will be required for the expansion of AI, for example. So I think that connection between pragmatism and technology is really, for me, it's something that's completely constructed when you think of it. Yeah, I don't know if I was really answering your question. I think it just made me think of that.
I think it's a really good point, though. I think it is easy, and I guess, in many ways deliberate, that is the way in which technology is presented, both as if it is neutral, as you said earlier, but also as if, it is pragmatic and makes sense, and it's actually just sort of, pragmatically minded people getting down to solving problems, whereas actually sometimes these things are presented as much more fully formed than they actually are, and they're a lot more speculative, than we think. You mentioned there about the kind of the election of Donald Trump and the way in which that's had an impact, and I wanted to ask, actually, in terms of something you said before around the fact that the limitations of philanthropy mean that there's only a certain amount and a relatively finite amount you can do just with direct philanthropic funding, and actually you always then have to start looking at how you influence external actors, and that usually means governmental involvement. I guess that has always been a challenge, not just in the US, but in lots of places, because, the reality is the sticking point for a lot of the big changes that are necessary to address climate, it feels as though are political ones. But that context has obviously shifted even more with the election of Trump. What's your sense of the kind of additional challenges that this will pose for philanthropic funders interested in this space? Will they have to adapt their strategies and approaches?
Yeah, and I think we're already seeing it. I think the recent announcements by the Bezos Earth Fund, for instance, that it would stop funding, and I can't even remember the name of the initiative, but it was, to be perfectly honest, it was literally just an initiative that was really centered around, very kind of pro-business, kind of market-based approach to addressing the climate issue. But again, I guess that's kind of sending kind of a first kind of strong signal of, what might happen, if Bezos Earth Fund is defunding these organizations, again, that are very kind of quite mainstream in terms of their approach. What's going to happen to the climate justice groups that the Bezos Earth Fund is also funding, because it is funding certain climate justice groups in the US, So yeah, I think, my impression right now is that it's still kind of early days, and I think there's kind of almost kind of a paralysis. Which is, I wouldn't say it's restricted to the climate philanthropy space. It's just a general paralysis that we're seeing in the face of, these kind of this massive, like, constant flow of announcements that we're seeing from Trump. And I think obviously, so it makes it difficult to kind of identify kind of a clear kind of response. But it's true that what we are seeing is that, at least amongst the climate philanthropy crowd, either there's a form of silence where you're kind of seeing like no one's anywhere to be seen. There's another group that is kind of now clearly positioning itself as supporters of Trump, or at least as being kind of, and we all saw them at the Capitol when at the inauguration. So obviously Bezos is the best example of that. And then there are a few, but they seem to be very limited, people who are kind of resisting in a way, and I think that's what So the example I would say is is Bloomberg, who announced that he would be stepping in, to fund the UNFCCC secretariat because the US is no longer, or is defunding the UNFCCC. So, at the same time, again, for when it comes to Bloomberg, I guess that's something that was to be expected, also given the fact that he also built his own kind of image and status through the critique of Donald Trump. But yeah, so I think so if we leave aside those two extremes, so Bezos on the one hand and Bloomberg on the other, you have this kind of big kind of center, which again we still haven't really heard. I think we're starting to get a few indications. I mean, I was able to, I've been kind of following a few interventions by people within some of the kind of mainstream climate philanthropies like Hewlett or ClimateWorks, for instance. The narrative that I'm starting to see is this kind of idea that, and this is kind of interesting, is this kind of idea that, well, actually, we shouldn't be too worried, or it's not that big a deal because the United States is only kind of 9 or 10% of global emissions. So essentially, even if the US, decides to kind of increase its emissions, what counts is the other 90%, and so again, I find that interesting because for so many years, these are the same people who have been pushing at the international level this idea that we can't solve the crisis without the United States. So suddenly now, like the United States is no longer a problem, and we don't need the United States, we don't need them anymore. So that's something that I'm starting to see, and this is, is the case for, this is something that a guy from Hewlett mentioned and a person from ClimateWorks as well. And what they're also saying is that also means, obviously, that we need to start investing in other regions. So that's something maybe also to look out for. I mean, what I'm guessing is they might redeploy their funding to other regions where they see potential, but at the same time, stop reducing their investments as well at the international and the multilateral level in particular, because I don't think, obviously the big impact of all this is that it's weakened the multilateral climate system. The fact that the US is no longer in it, it does weaken that space. So so one possibility is that climate funders also disengage from the international space and have a more kind of targeted, region-specific approach.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to come back to that idea of the sort of shift in emphasis geographically about some of these debates, because I think that mirrors something interesting that's happening in philanthropy as well. Just before I do that, though, I wanted to come back to what you were saying there, because I think that point about those potentially different approaches at either end of a spectrum to Trump being elected, I think there genuinely is that danger, as you say, that with the example of Bezos, you have the kind of Timothy Snyder's idea of people obeying in advance and actually kind of doing what they think that the administration wants them to do before they're even asked to. And then you've got people like Bloomberg potentially doing things that can be framed as if they are resistance in some sense. On that latter one, what I wanted to ask was, I noted the example of Bloomberg as well, and I guess whilst it wasn't that surprising with Bloomberg, because it's very much, as you say, his track record and he's built his reputation around that, it does raise quite an awkward question about the democratic legitimacy of philanthropy, because it's easy if you're if you care about climate issues to cheer and say hooray, somebody stepped in and is covering these, but actually from a fundamental point of view, it's quite anti-democratic if the elected government has a different agenda. Is there any way of squaring that circle?
No, I completely agree, and I think that's obviously the other side of the picture that I think is also really significant, as you say. I mean, I think the fact that he is effectively stepping in and stepping in for an elected government, even if you disagree with it. It does raise, I think, serious issues, and in a way, it validates this idea that actually, there is kind of a plutocracy that is extremely powerful, that is extremely influential, and not just in national political affairs, but in global political affairs as well. And just the whole thing. I mean, just the whole kind of staging of Bloomberg's intervention was also kind of interesting to see. So the fact that he took out a statement, and in the press statement itself, you have a quote of the current kind of executive director of the UNFCCC thanking him for his support. In a way, you could see that as kind of a power move as well. In a way, it's also about asserting your authority, over the UNFCCC, but also over the kind of the pro-climate camp. And I think that's kind of that I think is a really kind of big question that I think needs to be addressed. It's because what we're seeing, I think, with Trump is this kind of idea that they're kind of the good and the bad billionaires in a way. I think again, Gates is I think also trying to kind of frame himself as the kind of the good billionaire, and we're seeing this as well with the kind of all the stuff he's doing around his memoirs right now. the kind of the responsible, the normal, just the kind of they're trying to. It's almost a question of image. How they present themselves is almost the opposite of Elon Musk in a way in terms of their style. But fundamentally, they are also very powerful as a result of the money that they have. And they have historically, and especially when it comes to climate and climate policy, they have exerted a lot of influence on the direction that the climate debate has taken, both at the international and the domestic level in the United States. So I think that's the challenge, I think, for people, who are kind of observing all this, is that we don't lose track of that either, and we don't necessarily fall into that idea that there are kind of good and bad billionaires, because obviously I think that's a risk that we're kind of seeing right now, that we kind of start categorizing billionaires, and that we lose track of the fact that good billionaires are also extremely influential in terms of politically. And therefore, that we should, kind of coming back to your question, also think about how do we ensure that they are accountable in some way or another. How do we kind of ensure that their power is kind of contained, or at least abides by a certain number of basic rules, your democratic rules.
And I think the challenge here is it's always in the situation where the incumbent power then is doing things that lots of people think are regressive or problematic and are going to do damage. It's very easy then to say, oh, well, again, pragmatically, let's just allow the billionaires that we do agree with to kind of do what they're doing because it's a short-term fix. But as you say, kind of the difficulty there is you get caught in sort of hypocrisy where you like the ones that you like and you don't like the ones that you don't like.
Yeah, and if we come to return to the climate issue, you could, to a certain extent, you could also argue that the political situation that the United States is in now is also partially a consequence of the types of policies and climate policies that have been pushed by people like Bloomberg and others. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, and if you look at who benefited most from the Inflation Reduction Act, it isn't the kind of U.S. working class who benefited most. It's actually either the kind of the richest people in the country, so the people who had kind of the highest kind of levels of income, or like the corporations and the investors who were also kind of, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, able or benefited from various types of federal support to fund clean energy or clean technologies. So I think that's something we shouldn't lose track of. And obviously, the risk, I think, in the current moment is that we kind of return to a very kind of facile kind of division between, pro and anti-climate, between this kind of idea that, essentially, we're Bloomberg and everyone else, we're all in the same team. We're all kind of, we're all on the same side. When, yes, obviously we are, in the sense that we all agree that we need to do something about the climate issue and that it's an important issue. However, I think there are fundamental differences when it comes to the types of solutions and the types of answers that we can bring, and also how those answers affect other kind of questions, such as questions of justice, inequality, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I guess that becomes more difficult to do when the political moment is so sort of centered around creating very clear binaries and divisions and trying to kind of allocate people into for and against camps on issues like climate. I wanted to come back to what you were saying before about the potential sort of shift in emphasis in thinking about climate issues away from the US to other areas, because one of the things that's interesting in philanthropy over certainly the last decade or so has been the sense that there is potentially a pretty fundamental shift in the sort of center of gravity of global philanthropy as you get new centers of wealth emerging in China and Asia and also to some extent in Africa these days. And I guess, even more recently, the fact that the US seems to be willing to kind of cede some of its soft power in terms of global issues with the dismantling of USAID. Actually, what do you think that's going to mean in terms of where not just the emphasis of the kind of philanthropic efforts from the US and the UK go, but is there also going to be space opened up for climate-focused philanthropy from other places? And do you think that might look different in nature?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, really good question, to which I don't have a really good answer, unfortunately. But I think it is a possibility, absolutely. And as you rightly say, I think we might see something that's quite similar to, what we might see as a result of the dismantlement of USAID. These are all instruments of soft power fundamentally at the end of the day. And I think that's something as well that you actually find in some of the responses that we're seeing from some of these climate funders to Trump's election. They're saying, well, it's the United States is going to lose out of this. We are, as the US, we're going to lose out. And I think that kind of obviously comes, reconnects with what historically philanthropy is and how essentially, US philanthropy is US philanthropy. So it is also an instrument that is in many ways, historically has been aligned with a particular perception of what the US interests are at the international level. So yeah, so their disengagement, and the disengagement of the US in general, and potentially also the disengagement of certain funders from the climate space. Yeah, I would imagine that they might create a vacuum that will be filled by other philanthropists from other regions. I guess, yeah. What still is unclear for me, and again, that's probably why, because I haven't really done enough research on the matter, but is at least on my radar, and maybe that's again because I'm very focused on the US and Europe. I haven't really seen any of major kind of non-US or non-European climate funders emerge so far. It doesn't mean to say that they don't exist, and it actually, as you say, and they might actually seize this moment as an opportunity to engage. But I haven't. I mean, I'm not able to kind of give you any names, for instance, of big climate philanthropies from Africa, Asia, even Latin America. Who would potentially be in a position to kind of fill the vacuum that's currently being created.
No, I mean, I can't think of them either, but I think it's a really interesting thing to potentially keep watch for. And I wonder also if part of the challenge here is one that I guess you get more widely with climate philanthropy, in that, the paradigm that we have of climate philanthropy is the kind of Bezos Earth Fund and the work, Gates does, which is very clearly positioned as climate philanthropy, whereas there is lots of other philanthropy that ostensibly focuses on other issues, but actually is to some extent about climate. And I wonder whether there's more of that going on in other parts of the world and whether it might become more overtly climate.
Yeah, completely. And I think again I think that's a good point. And that obviously also connects to this kind of constant difficulty of defining what climate philanthropy is, essentially. That's also why I'm always quite cautious about even data that's produced about the scale of climate philanthropy, because as you point out, I mean, I guess you can work on health, you can work on education, but you could say in a way that is also, you could also connect that and also present that potentially as a form of climate philanthropy as well. So absolutely, I think that's also maybe something that we might also see in that, including in places like Europe or the US, is that funders who are not traditionally kind of labeled as climate philanthropists start to maybe more directly engage on the topic, or through the work that they're already doing, maybe kind of highlight more how that kind of relates to the climate issue.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see. And I guess a related question touched on something that you've mentioned a couple of times already, which is the idea of focusing more on climate justice than maybe kind of more traditional ideas of kind of addressing climate issues directly. Maybe, I know this is something you've done work on, and it certainly seemed to me, at least maybe a few years ago, that there was starting to be a kind of shift within the climate space towards recognizing the need to get the right balance. Again, I wonder if that's something that will, be slightly more difficult in the current climate. Sorry, no pun intended there. But political climate, I meant there. Maybe you could just say a bit about what it actually means to talk about sort of justice-focused efforts when it comes to climate, and what that distinction is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of justice, I think, historically, at least within the international climate debate, it's been very much framed in terms of, historical responsibilities of countries. So, this kind of idea that, historically, European countries, the United States, they have kind of contributed most to greenhouse gas emissions. And as a result of that, they should also do more when it comes to addressing the climate issue. So that's kind of a fundamental principle, in fact, of the UN and Framework Convention on Climate Change. Is this idea of historical differentiated responsibility. So we acknowledge the fact that we all have a responsibility, but those responsibilities are historically differentiated depending on the country. But what we've seen, especially from the late 90s and 2000s onwards, and this again is in a context where we saw the emergence of an anti-globalization movement, the World Social Forum, and a growing kind of critique of neoliberal globalization. There was an increasing focus on questions of justice that were no longer restricted to North and South, but that were also actually centered on rich and poor. And so this kind of focus on the responsibility of wealthy people, or the top 10% or the richest 10% of the world's population, regardless of where they're situated, in the global North or the global South, and saying, if you look at the emissions of those 10%, they represent about 40 or 50% of the emissions of the poorest 50% of the population. And therefore, at the same time, those poor 50% are also the ones who are the most vulnerable in the face of the climate issue. So that, and that has also had quite a big impact, let's say, on how we frame the climate issue, because it's put forward this idea that, well, again, if you emit more, if you have a greater responsibility as an individual, then you should also be contributing more to address the problem. Now, obviously, the problem with that framing, when you come to philanthropy, is that obviously philanthropy is largely a product of extreme wealth accumulation. So that's also explains why there's always been quite an uncomfortable kind of connection or relationship, let's say, between especially the kind of the mainstream, the big funders, and in particular, and this is, I think, another important distinction, the climate philanthropies like Bezos, who are still run and owned by the rich individual who's built up his fortune, and legacy foundations like Ford or Rockefeller, where it's actually quite a different story. But those foundations are still managed by a rich individual. Obviously, if you start talking about this question of responsibilities of rich people and how they should pay more, that potentially becomes more problematic. But I think even Bezos, they were kind of forced to kind of acknowledge this question, especially on the back of all the mobilizations that we've been seeing since late 2018 with Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg. There was this kind of moment, I think, within the history of the kind of climate debate where suddenly kind of questions of justice became kind of really central. But I think now, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that that's no longer really the case. And that's also, for me, why essentially the question of climate justice has also largely disappeared, I would say, from the narratives and the discourses of these, as I say, these big climate funders in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is. Yeah, I mean, that's worrying, I guess. I mean, in practical terms, then you've mentioned there about the sort of impact that the emergence of movements like Extinction Rebellion and activists like Greta Thunberg had. Is that, in a sense, kind of where philanthropy seeks to be more focused on climate justice? Is part of what it means to think about not funding sort of traditional non-profits and sort of large international NGOs, and actually think about funding activists and movements. And is that both a challenge, as you say, in terms of the fact that you as a funder have to kind of accept the implicit critique of you and how you made your money, and potentially if you're an individual donor, literally you as a person? And is it also a challenge because it's even more difficult then to get any sense of the direct attribution of where you're putting your funding and the impact that it has? Because I guess, funders often like to be able to say, we put X amount in, it produced, Y outcomes, we could measure this. Whereas if you're funding movements and activism, the results might be incredible, but it's very hard to measure them and even more difficult to attribute them. Do you think that's potentially a challenge?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think there's always this obsession with metrics and kind of ability to actually translate, the money that you're putting into something into, tons of greenhouse gases that you're not emitting fundamentally. And I think that's how the kind of climate philanthropy, especially from the early 2000s, again, very much influenced by the kind of entrepreneurial kind of culture of that period, how that's, it's definitely something that's very present within climate philanthropy and continues to be to an extent. At the same time, I think, when it comes to movements, and in particular, when you think of like groups like Extinction Rebellion or others, I think what was the reason why some philanthropies, including kind of very mainstream philanthropies, invested in them, is that for very little money, because it was really a small amount of money that they could throw at these organizations, they could potentially have quite a big impact, in particular when it comes to getting the climate issue to be kind of a top priority in a way. And I think that's, so without, being kind of, without having kind of very detailed data, I think they saw that, and I think that's one of the things with Extinction Rebellion is how a movement that was quite self-organized, that did kind of really things on the cheap. If you compare them to, I don't know, Greenpeace doing kind of an action, that costs hundreds of thousands of pounds to do. In this case, it cost literally nothing, and they were all over the place. They were all over the news, and everyone spoke about them. So I think that's what they saw. I think they saw that there was, even if it was difficult to quantify, they still saw that there was a really good kind of return on investment when it comes to funding these groups, even though they had sometimes a very kind of critical kind of narrative and discourse. What they saw is that this put climate on the map. This meant that we were talking about climate change. And also, they didn't really, I don't think fundamentally they saw these movements as a threat to them, because these were movements that were also very focused, and they were pushing, in many ways, the same kind of narrative that they were pushing. Narratives like follow the science, is something that you also found, in kind of Extinction Rebellion rallies, or, Greta Thunberg, she was saying literally the same thing. And that's exactly what, some of the big climate philanthropies were also saying, So, in a way, I don't think they saw them as a threat, but they did see the potential. They did see them as a way of, ensuring that climate was the priority, was high on the agenda. And then when it came to influencing actually policy, well, that's when they were, they would use the other organizations that they also fund that were pushing for policies in a way that were more aligned with, what they believed to be the right course of action to address the climate issue.
Yeah, which I guess is the classic sort of balance of insider and outsider influencing, isn't it? And in what you were saying there is something really interesting about, the idea that funding some of these groups or activists is very cost effective in many ways because it's relatively cheap and you can get sort of outsized results. But whether that needs to be balanced against the risk tolerance of the funder, because often the way in which those organizations get that outsized influence is by doing things that the funders would presumably be relatively uncomfortable with doing themselves. So I think it's that interaction is fascinating, and kind of how much of that risk they're willing to take.
No, it is. I remember with, when it was with Extinction Rebellion, it was just interesting to see how a lot of these people were actually expressing support for civil disobedience. It's kind of, it wasn't a problem. I guess the one thing that they've always been critical of, and I think that's the thing that they wouldn't fund, is when there was violence, essentially. So there's always this question of violence has always been an important one. But when it comes to, peacefully kind of occupying a street, for example, or whatever, that's acceptable.
Yeah, although I guess, again, a calculation about the point at which public opinion shifts against that and whether it's an effective.
And they follow, obviously they're always aligned. It was at a time when public opinion was globally supportive of the movement, and again, that's also why it's interesting to see how now we're in a moment, I think, where, climate more generally is not considered as a central issue, or at least in public opinion. Right now, it's the kind of cost of living crisis. There are so many other pressing questions. And I think that also goes in a way to explain why there's also less interest, I think, in climate movements from climate funders. At least that's the impression that I have.
Yeah, interesting. I'm aware we're coming up on the time that we've got. I just wanted to ask one more, well, possibly two more questions. One was just, we haven't really touched on it yet, but one of the things I think that will inevitably come up in conversations around climate and philanthropy is the UN SDGs. I'd be just really interested in your sense of, whether they are still relevant and useful, and, in what way are they useful, either as a benchmark or as a way of kind of directing philanthropic resources effectively?
I think that for a long time, the SDGs, at least the impression I've had, is that they've been kind of overshadowed by climate. I think in a way that's also reflected in the philanthropy space. But again, maybe that's because I've been working on philanthropy more than anything else. So maybe that's also probably a bias that I have. I don't know if the SDGs are still, in a way, my general impression is that the SDGs have never occupied the front of the stage. And so as a result, they've continued to to exist and to be referred to by a range of different actors. But I don't know. I don't think that they will become kind of more or less important in the coming in the coming weeks or months. Yeah, again, but as I say, I don't think I've followed enough the SDG conversation to be able to have like a clear kind of sense of like where that's going.
No, fair enough. And I guess one of the challenges when it comes to the SDGs in particular, I think potentially for philanthropy, but perhaps even more so for the way in which they affect the activities of corporates, is a sense that it's perhaps too easy to retrofit, into the framework of the SDGs, things that you were essentially already doing anyway. Is that a concern within the climate space as well, that actually any measure that you create or any sort of framework that you create that's intended to guide behavior or activity in one way, the challenge is also people, if people could just simply redefine what they were already doing in order to make it look as though they're meeting those requirements.
Yeah, I think that's potentially, that's probably true, like for the SDG conversation. I think it might be slightly more difficult for climate because obviously the benchmark for climate is, it's the science of climate change, and it's the question of, essentially it's like, where are we at in terms of global emissions? There's that element where, in a way, for climate, there are ways of kind of measuring fairly precisely, both like global emissions, but even more specific emissions relating to a country or relating to a specific sector. So I don't know if potentially that makes it a bit more difficult as well to present kind of to project this kind of image of being, active on climate change or doing things on climate change when, obviously your narrative is kind of contradicted by the reality of your emissions in a way. So I don't know if that has something to do with, that might be something that, differentiates the climate debate more specifically from the kind of the broader SDG conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, maybe those measures are actually, as you say, kind of harder to fudge in a way. You just kind of, they are what they are, and the science kind of tells you whether or not you're having an impact on them. Which I guess leads me to my final question, which is, slightly a kind of big picture looking ahead one, which is, given the current context, around, the recent changes politically, but also just the way that debates and action on climate have been going in recent years, how optimistic should we be? And I guess in particular, what can philanthropy meaningfully be doing from this point, at this point in time, in your view, that could genuinely kind of have an impact in driving things in the direction they need to go?
The answer I usually give to that question is, I think for me, it's a big part of the answer lies in kind of philanthropy in a way, reconnecting with what it was maybe 30 or 40 years ago, at least when it comes to the environmental conversation. When I looked at the work of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund or Ford in the 1970s and 80s, when they started to work on environmental issues, and by no means am I saying that what they're doing is ideal or is perfect, but at the time at least, I felt that there was still kind of a recognition of the need to not necessarily kind of carry a ready-made answer or to kind of, but to create the conditions for kind of a conversation and a debate, and I think that's possibly what philanthropy can do, is to to create the conditions for that conversation, not on the science of climate change, because I think we all agree what the science of climate change says, but more on how we translate that science into action. What are the different options that exist? And I think because that's really for me the main critique I have as well towards the kind of the Bezos style climate philanthropy is that they have a very clear idea of what they want, and they have such a clear idea of what they want that to an extent they're also trying to kind of marginalize alternative voices or critical voices. When in fact I think in this particular moment I think it's really necessary as well to allow kind of alternative views to also exist, and to be listened to. So my hope is that those kind of spaces are created, and also that we don't fall into the trap of saying that the urgency of the climate crisis means that we don't have time to kind of have these conversations. I think they are worthwhile conversations, and I would say that they're worthwhile conversations because I think had we had them earlier, we would probably not be in the situation that we're in now. And just maybe a final point then, when it comes to what philanthropic actors might play a big role, at least in the climate space, I think that kind of comes back to maybe that's where also those legacy funders are going to be more important now than ever, because I think they're less directly. They're less tempted to align themselves, with whoever's in power. As we're seeing with all these kind of billionaire philanthropists, Bezos in particular, Ford, they don't have to align themselves. They're completely, they're independent in a way, and I think that independence will be extremely valuable going forward, and hopefully that will also enable them to actually support and fund things that, again, are not necessarily, are not just kind of blindly aligned with both the people in Washington or what the mainstream wants when it comes to climate action.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I guess I'm very timely because that's a moment where there's a lot of debate, particularly in the US, understandably, about what the role of philanthropy and particularly foundations should be at this moment. And I think some quite sort of almost an existential crisis for the philanthropy world as a whole. And I think thinking about climate, that's a really good argument you've given there for a role that they could play if they're willing to accept that with a bit of bravery. Just remains to say thanks ever so much, Edouard, for finding time to come on the podcast. It's really great to have a chance to talk. I think really timely issue and lots of fascinating ideas in there. I'll put links in the show notes to places where people can find more on you and your work, and hope to be able to pick up the conversation at some point in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, well, my thanks again to Edouard for finding time to come on the podcast. It was really great to have a chance to talk to him. Really, really interesting conversation, I thought, and as I said before, very timely, sort of depressingly timely in many ways. I will put links in the show notes to places where you can find things that Edouard's written about this, and also any things that I've written or previous episodes of the podcast that might be relevant and of interest. If you're interested more broadly in discussions like this about philanthropy and civil society, then check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. If you've got ideas for people I could talk to or topics we could cover on this podcast in future, do get in touch. You can find my email at the website. If you want to keep up to date with things that I'm doing and my general musings on all things to do with philanthropy, feel free to follow me on social media. I'm on LinkedIn and Blue Sky primarily these days. Other than that, just subscribe, tell all your friends about it. If you're so minded, please do leave us a nice review wherever it is that you get your podcast. And I will see you next time. Bye!